Under one of the busiest public squares on the planet, a stone doorway sealed 500 years ago was waiting to expose a secret an empire tried to bury forever. Everyone assumes no Aztec king's tomb survived the conquest. A sealed chamber says otherwise. The Spanish Empire burned this city and buried its temple to make sure nobody looked again. Archaeologist Leonardo Lopez Lujan has spent a decade staring at that door, convinced a Mexica ruler is behind it. In 2015 at Templo Mayor, his team confirmed it was real. What's behind it might not be who everyone assumes. Look at that door again. It is not decorated. It is not grand. It is a rough seal of stone and mortar, built by hands that wanted something hidden and wanted it hidden well. And for over a decade, nobody outside a small circle of archaeologists has said, on the record, what is on the other side. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what sits above it. The Templo Mayor was the beating heart of the Aztec Empire, the great temple of Tenochtitlan, the city that stunned the Spanish so badly that soldiers who had seen the wonders of Europe wrote that they doubted their own eyes. 2 shrines rose from a single pyramid, one for Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and one for Tlaloc, the god of rain. Emperors were crowned here. Sacrifices were performed here. The empire's wealth, gathered from tribute cities across what is now central Mexico, was buried here as offerings to the gods. Then the Spanish arrived, and they didn't just conquer the city, they erased it. They tore down the temple stone by stone and used the rubble to build a new city on top of the old one, including the cathedral that still stands there today. For over 400 years, the greatest religious site in the Aztec world sat buried under Mexico City, forgotten so completely that most people assumed there was nothing left to find. Then, in 1978, electrical workers digging a trench hit a massive carved stone disc. It turned out to be Coyolxauhqui, the dismembered moon goddess, one of the most important sculptures in Mesoamerican history. That accidental strike opened the modern excavation of the Templo Mayor, led first by archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, and decades later by Leonardo Lopez Lujan. Since then, the project has pulled more than 200 offering boxes out of the ground. Jade, gold, coral, shells hauled from both the Pacific and the Caribbean, an ocean apart, carried on foot or by canoe to be buried as gifts to the gods. It is one of the richest, most closely studied archaeological sites on the planet, dug by hand, one careful layer at a time, for almost half a century, directly underneath one of the busiest downtown squares in North America. And in nearly 50 years of digging, in one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world, archaeologists have never found a single royal tomb. Not one. Not for any of the 11 emperors who ruled the Mexica from this exact spot. That is not a small gap. Every other major civilization researchers have deeply excavated eventually gives up its rulers. Egypt gave up the Valley of the Kings. China gave up the terracotta army guarding the first emperor's mausoleum. The Maya gave up Pakal's jade-masked tomb inside the Temple of the Inscriptions. The Aztec Empire, one of the last great pre-Columbian civilizations to fall, has given up almost nothing. The greatest ceremonial site the Mexica ever built, and it seems, on the surface, that not a single king was ever buried inside it. Outside, archaeologists have been blunt about how strange that is. Arizona State University archaeologist Michael Smith has called the total absence of royal burials at Tenochtitlan a long-standing puzzle in the field. Other specialists urge caution before anyone expects an Egyptian-style burial chamber. Aztec cremation practices mean any royal remains still down there are far more likely to be a handful of ash inside a small urn than a decorated tomb waiting to be opened like a movie set. That absence is the mystery underneath this whole story. And in 2013, something happened that made archaeologists start to think that absence might finally be about to end. That year, researchers working the northern side of the temple complex uncovered a large circular platform studded with 14 carved serpent heads, more than 50 feet across. Colonial-era writers had described a structure exactly like this, a place called the Quauxicalco, where the bodies of Mexico rulers were cremated after death. Finding it wasn't just another artifact, it was a landmark, a structure the old chronicles had talked about for centuries, suddenly standing in front of the people digging for it. Underneath its edge, the team lifted a 3-ton slab of andesite stone. Below it sat a small stone box. The skulls of 2 children, no older than 7, each missing a piece of the neck in a way that suggested they had been decapitated. Gold ornaments, sacrificial flint knives shaped like tiny blades of obsidian glass, eagle bone fragments. It was already a strange and violent discovery, but it wasn't the discovery that mattered most. While clearing that box, archaeologist Tomás Cruz noticed something the excavation notes almost undersell: a narrow corridor barely wide enough to crawl through, curving toward the center of the platform. His team followed it. It ran just over 8 meters, straight into the heart of the Quauxicalco. And at the end of it, the tunnel stopped at 2 separate doorways, each one sealed shut with cut masonry, deliberately, by hands that knew exactly what they were closing off. Lopez Lujan did not hide his excitement. Announcing the find, he said the working theory was 2 small chambers holding urns filled with the ashes of Mexico rulers, and admitted openly that the team might be wrong. It was the kind of admission you don't often hear from an archaeologist standing in front of cameras. He also named names. He suggested the doors might hold the remains of Moctezuma I and the emperors who followed him, Axayacatl and Tizoc. A resealing and a follow-up excavation were planned for the following year, and then publicly the trail goes quiet. There is no press conference confirming what was behind either door, no published excavation report describing urns, ashes, or bone. As of now, more than a decade later, whatever sits behind that stone seal in the dark has never been shown to the public. Maybe it was reburied to protect it. Maybe conservation concerns froze the work. Maybe the underlying question is simply harder to answer than a single dig season allows. But the silence itself has become part of the story. A sealed door, found and confirmed, that nobody will talk about on the record. If you want to understand why that door matters so much, you have to go back to the man everyone assumes is waiting behind it, Moctezuma II, the last independent emperor of the Aztec Empire, and the ruler who was on the throne when the Spanish arrived. By 1519, Moctezuma commanded an empire that stretched across central Mexico, built on tribute, war, and religious terror. Then Hernan Cortés marched into Tenochtitlan, and within days, Moctezuma was a hostage inside his own palace. For months he ruled as a puppet while the man who had captured him decided what came next. It is one of the strangest power reversals in recorded history. A god king, worshipped by his own people, held prisoner in his own capital. That palace is not a legend. In 2020, archaeologists confirmed they had physically located it, buried beneath a pawn shop a few streets from the cathedral, its basement floor revealing basalt slabs and stone carved with a relief of Quetzalcoatl. Researchers now know exactly where Moctezuma spent his final months alive. What they still do not know is where his body ended up after he died inside it. Then, in the final days of June 1520, it fell apart. The Mexico rose up against the Spanish occupation. Cortés, according to his own account, brought Moctezuma out onto a rooftop to calm the crowd below and convince his people to stand down. What happened next depends entirely on who is telling the story, and that disagreement is not a minor historical footnote. It is the first real crack in the official version of this entire mystery. The Spanish chroniclers, including the conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was there and wrote it all down decades later, claimed that Moctezuma's own people turned on him, hurling stones and rocks at their emperor, wounding him badly enough that he died a short time afterward. It's a clean story. It removes the Spanish from the blame. It lets the invaders claim they tried to protect a man his own subjects had already condemned as a traitor. Indigenous accounts tell a different story. The Florentine Codex, compiled decades later under the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, but drawn from Nahua informants who lived through the conquest, does not describe Moctezuma dying from an angry crowd. It describes the Spanish killing him once he was no longer useful to them, a captive who had run out of value. Two accounts, two versions of the same death, and nearly 500 years later, historians still cannot fully settle which is true. That disagreement matters because it changes how you have to read everything that supposedly happened to his body next. According to the Florentine Codex, after Moctezuma died, the Spanish threw his body, along with the body of another captured noble, out near the water's edge at a place called Teotihuacan. The Mexica recovered him. They carried him to a site called Copulco, and they cremated him there on a wooden pyre. The account is disturbingly specific. It describes the sound of his body as the fire consumed it. That is not a vague folk memory. That is a written record of what was supposedly done with the body of one of the most powerful men in the Americas, which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone hoping the sealed door at the Templo Mayor holds Moctezuma II. If that account is accurate, his remains were never brought back to the temple complex at all. Some point to Copulco, others point to Chapultepec, the hill where Aztec nobility had long-standing ties. There is no confirmed grave for either location. As one panel of Aztec specialists has put it bluntly, nobody even knows for certain that a discrete gravesite for Moctezuma ever existed in the first place. So if the Coaxacalco doors don't hold Moctezuma II, then who does Lopez Lujan think is back there, and why does the excavation record from over a century earlier suggest that the answer might already have been destroyed? In 1900, a Mexican archaeologist named Leopoldo Batres led one of the earliest formal excavations near the Templo Mayor, decades before anyone understood exactly what they were digging into, and his records from that period are frustratingly thin. Some researchers now believe Batres may have struck the very platform where a ruler's cremated remains were kept, without recognizing what he had found. If that theory is correct, evidence of a royal burial may have already been unearthed and lost, decades before archaeology in Mexico had the methods to identify it. And there's a second, quieter obstacle sitting on top of the mystery: the Metropolitan Cathedral itself. When the Spanish flattened the Great Temple, they built directly on and around the sacred precinct, reusing carved Aztec stone in their own church walls. Archaeologists have found pre-Hispanic temple floors beneath the cathedral that were simply whitewashed over rather than removed. An active, functioning cathedral now sits on some of the most archaeologically significant ground in the Americas, which means entire sections of the complex are permanently off limits to excavation. The mystery isn't just buried, parts of it are structurally unreachable. So archaeologists have had to work around the edges, piecing the story together one careful discovery at a time. And 9 years before the sealed doors turned up, one of those discoveries changed everything about how seriously anyone took the idea of a royal tomb at all. In 2006, workers with the Urban Archaeology Program, digging beside the Templo Mayor at a colonial-era building called the Casa de las Ajaracas, hit something enormous: a monolith of solid stone, more than 4 meters long, weighing close to 12 tons, the largest Aztec carved stone ever recovered. It depicted Tlaltecutli, the earth goddess, sprawled and devouring, her body carved in unnerving detail. Carved into the stone was a glyph reading Tin Rabbit. In the Aztec calendar, that glyph corresponds to a specific year, 1502. That is the exact year the Emperor Ahuitzotl died. That is not a coincidence archaeologists take lightly. The platform where the monolith was found appears to mark the spot where the cremated remains of Mexica emperors were ceremonially placed, and the date carved into the stone points directly at one of them by name. Ground-penetrating radar, run over the site before anyone broke ground, detected chambers underneath the monolith before a single shovel went in. That is worth sitting with for a second. Researchers were reading what was hidden beneath solid stone without touching it, using a technology that sends radio waves into the earth and measures what bounces back. It is the same basic principle as an ultrasound, except the patient is the ground itself, and the news is either a burial chamber or another dead end. In 2008, the team excavated beneath the monolith and found what is now known as Offering 126, one of the richest ritual deposits ever pulled from Mexico soil. More than 1,600 animals representing over 160 species, most pulled from the ocean, sea cucumbers, coral, an articulated female eagle skeleton, still wearing a shell pendant from a species found only on the Pacific coast, hundreds of kilometers from where it was buried. The deposit wasn't random. It was arranged in layers, deliberately, like a map of the Aztec universe compressed into a stone box, built by an empire with no wheeled transport and no horses to move any of it. But even Offering 126 wasn't a tomb. It was an offering, extraordinarily wealthy, tied to Ahuitzotli's death year, but still not a body. Which brings the story back to that tunnel 5 years later, and those two sealed doors. Here's where the theory gets genuinely tempting. If the Quetzalcoatl really is the cremation platform the old chronicles describe, and the Tlaltecutli monolith really does mark Ahuitzotli's death year directly above it, the location makes sense as a burial ground for rulers. That theory isn't a fringe idea invented for a thumbnail. It came from the lead archaeologist on the project himself, based on physical, dated evidence sitting one level up. It is also, still, unconfirmed. Nobody has published an image of what is inside those two doorways. The most tempting explanation and the proven one are not currently the same thing. Then, in 2019, the project produced another discovery that reopened the entire question. At the foot of the temple's main staircase, researchers uncovered the skeleton of a jaguar dressed for war, fitted with a wooden disc bearing the image of Huitzilopochtli and equipped with an atlatl, the spear-throwing weapon used by Mexica warriors. Buried alongside it was a child, roughly 9 years old, dressed in the same wooden regalia representing the war god, wearing a jade necklace fitted with hawk bone attachments shaped like wings. Around them, archaeologists found more than 20 finely worked black flint knives. It is one of the most elaborate and disturbing offerings ever pulled from the site. And when the team went to finish excavating the box beneath the jaguar's skeleton, they found something they had not planned for. A distinct bulge in the floor of the offering, sitting directly under the animal's remains. Speaking to reporters, Lopez Lujan didn't downplay it. He said whatever was underneath that jaguar was something enormously significant, and that the team was expecting a major discovery, floating the possibility that it could be the missing urn holding Ahuitzotli's remains. That announcement is now years old. There has been no public confirmation of what that bulge actually turned out to be. Which means, right now, there are two separate unresolved leads sitting in the same excavation, both flagged by the same archaeologist as likely to hold a Mexica ruler's remains, and neither one has produced a body the public has actually seen. The pattern did not stop there. In 2022, the same team uncovered another offering inside the Quetzalcoatl itself, more than 160 starfish, alongside a second jaguar burial. Then, in 2026, INAH announced 3 more offerings, tied directly to the reign of Moctezuma I, the emperor who ruled roughly a century before his more famous descendant and namesake. Together, researchers say those offerings complete a full ritual circuit around the base of the temple, laid out in a pattern that took specialists years to recognize as deliberate. It is the most direct physical evidence yet connecting a specific named Mexica emperor to this exact patch of ground. Still not a body, but the closest the excavation has ever come to placing a king by name at the doorstep of his own temple. So here is the reversal. Underneath this entire investigation, the video you clicked on promised a hidden tomb that could expose Montezuma's lost ancestors. But the deeper you dig into the actual evidence, the less that framing holds up, and the more interesting the real story becomes. If the doors behind that tunnel hold anyone, the strongest written record we have says it is almost certainly not Moctezuma II. His remains, if the Florentine Codex is accurate, were burned somewhere outside the temple grounds entirely, at a location nobody has ever located with certainty. What the Coaxacualco doors actually threaten to expose is something bigger and stranger: the rulers before him. Moctezuma I, Axayacatl, Tizoc, Ahuitzotl, the dynasty that built the empire. Moctezuma II eventually lost. Their bodies are the ones the historical record says should be somewhere on this site, and their bodies are the ones that have never been found, in any form, anywhere, in nearly 50 years of digging. The most famous name in Aztec history has been quietly pulling attention away from the actual mystery this whole time. Not one missing emperor, but an entire missing dynasty buried somewhere underneath a cathedral that will not let archaeologists dig freely enough to find them. And even if researchers eventually confirm what's behind those doors, the story does not end there, because Mexico is already fighting over Aztec remains it has not lost underground. It has lost them on the other side of an ocean. In Vienna, inside the Welt Museum, sits a headdress of iridescent green Quetzal feathers and gold ornamentation, traditionally linked to Moctezuma II himself. Records place it in Austrian royal collections as far back as the late 1500s. Mexico has formally requested its return since 1991, and the pressure has never fully gone away. Around the 500th anniversary of the conquest, the campaign intensified again, with Mexican officials pushing publicly for its repatriation. Austria has refused every time, citing the same reason: the feathers are too fragile to survive the journey. A joint study between the two countries reportedly concluded that transporting the headdress could cause the equivalent of a century's worth of natural decay in a matter of hours. Here's the uncomfortable part historians keep circling back to. Nobody has ever definitively proven the headdress belonged to Moctezuma at all. The attribution is traditional, not confirmed by any surviving document written at the time it left Mexico. So Mexico is fighting to reclaim an object it cannot fully prove is the object it wants back, while Austria is refusing to return something it may not actually have the right story about either. That is not a minor museum squabble. That is national identity, colonial history, and unresolved provenance, all tangled around a single glass case, with nobody willing to blink first. Back in Mexico City, the excavation faces a different kind of pressure, one that has nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with physics. The city was built on the drain bed of a lake, and the water table beneath it sits dangerously close to the surface. Dig too deep, too fast, and the pit floods. Archaeologists working the deepest sections have described working suspended in slings while pumps fight to hold back groundwater, racing against a site that is actively trying to swallow the evidence back down. Above all of it sits a living, working cathedral in a modern metropolis of over 20 million people, most of whom have no idea what is sitting 8 meters beneath their morning commute. So who actually benefits if the sealed doors stay sealed? It isn't sinister in the way conspiracy theories usually frame these things. An unconfirmed tomb generates constant public fascination and funding, in a way a fully excavated, fully explained chamber never quite manages to sustain. A confirmed royal tomb, meanwhile, would be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the history of the Americas. There's no reason to assume anyone is deliberately hiding a discovery, but there is every reason to notice how much institutional weight, national pride, and religious sensitivity is stacked directly on top of two small stone doors. There is a religious dimension to that caution too. Excavating further into consecrated cathedral ground, in search of the remains of rulers whose religion the Spanish spent centuries trying to erase, is not a decision any single archaeologist gets to make alone. It touches church authorities, heritage offices, and a living congregation that has every right to the ground under its own altar, The sealed door is not just a scientific problem. It is sitting at the exact point where archaeology, religion, and national memory all have competing claims on the same 8 meters of earth. That does not prove there's a body waiting behind them. But it does mean the simple explanation, the one that says archaeologists just haven't gotten around to it yet, gets harder to accept the longer that silence continues. Here is what we actually know, stated plainly. No royal tomb from the Aztec Empire has ever been confirmed found, anywhere, by anyone. A sealed tunnel and 2 masonry doorways sit at the heart of the most sacred structure the Mexica ever built. Discovered in 2013, confirmed in 2015, and never publicly reopened since. The man most people assume is waiting behind them almost certainly is not there, according to the best surviving written record of his death. And the dynasty that might actually be back there, the emperors who built the empire before its final collapse, remain as missing today as they were nearly 50 years ago when this excavation first began. The door is still there. It hasn't moved. Somewhere beneath a cathedral full of worshippers, under a city of 20 million people going about their mourning, a 500-year-old seal is still holding, exactly where it was left in 2015, still hiding whatever the Mexica placed behind it before the Spanish arrived and buried an empire's memory under their own church. If you want to know the moment it finally opens, the moment archaeology either confirms or kills the oldest missing dynasty in the Americas, subscribe, because when that door finally gives up its answer, you'll want to be watching. So, tell me, if that chamber turns out to be empty, does that make the mystery smaller, or does it just move somewhere else we haven't looked yet?